Hello and welcome to the In the Tank podcast, episode 205, the podcast that explores the work of think tanks across the country. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendall, and we got a full room today. We've got sitting across from me, we have Jim Likely, Director of Communications here at the Heartland Institute. How are you doing today, good sir?
Doing good. Hey, everybody.
We also got Isaac Orr, Policy Fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. Isaac, we are not on camera today, so you don't have to gesture towards the camera. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great today, Donnie.
Thank you. Justin Haskins also joining us. He is the editorial director here at the Heartland Institute. I think that's 4 times in a row that I got your title correct. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. So since you got the title correct 4 times, it's time to change the title.
That's right. I think that's how you do it. Sweet. So we've got a bunch of topics to talk about. We have quite a few updates on our Democratic primary survivor pool, so we'll get into that a little bit. We're also going to talk about wind and energy and how terrible they are. We've got a few more examples. Just recently developing examples of why there's such terrible alternatives to reliable, fossil fuel-based energies. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the whole Facebook and conservative censorship, maybe, who knows, whatever. We'll look at that report a little bit. But before we get into any of those topics, Jim, we've got a couple of things on Heartland's docket coming up. You want to tell our fine audience about what's going on here?
Yeah, in Salt Lake City on Monday, August 26th, the United Nations is having what they call the Civil Society, and they put that in quotes actually, Civil Society Sustainability Conference. And as we are wont to do, Heartland is going to go to Salt Lake City on Monday to offer counter-programming to that. It does tie in a little bit to the folly of wind power and trying to go to renewables, because that's what this is all going to be about. And so the Heartland speakers there are going to explain that the policies that the United Nations would impose upon the world will obviously make energy a lot more expensive, and it would keep much of the developing world from lifting their societies out of poverty. And so the United Nations actually would do more harm to the poor that they pretend to care about.
No, I'm sure we'll get into that when we talk about wind and solar.
We certainly will. And so Heartland is going to be live streaming from Salt Lake City a counter-programming conference with several speakers who will give presentations explaining why the United Nations solutions are really, really bad news for the poor. And that's going to be from 11 a.m. Eastern Time to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be in Mountain Time, so that's 9 a.m. Mountain Time to 1 p.m. Mountain Time. But 11 a.m. Eastern, tune in. Just go to Heartland's YouTube page, Heartland Tube, and it'll be right there on the front.
Sweet deal. What was the thing that I was mixing it up? I thought you were going to like Chile or something like that.
We are going to Chile. We're going to Chile for the COP25,
okay.
The Conference of the Parties United Nations thing. As a matter of fact, we're also very close to publicly announcing that on September 23rd, the General Assembly of the United Nations opens up in Turtle Bay. They're in New York City. They open up their session, and on the 23rd, they're having a full-day conference on climate. And what do you know? I think we're going to try to do a climate debate in New York City to counter-program that as well. So stay tuned.
I hate to break it to you, but we are delivering this podcast to the public, so I think you just publicly announced it. So.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't know this podcast has listeners. It's interesting to know that now. I thought this was just for us. But
in addition to that,
yes.
In October, we also have a big event coming up. So do you want to pitch that one real quick as well?
Yes. We have our benefit dinner on October 4th. That's a Friday. So I guess in about 42 days' time. Our keynote speaker and the honoree of the Heartland Liberty Prize is Glenn Beck, the national radio talk show host, champion of freedom, Tea Party champion, a guy who put 300,000 people in the National Mall to basically stand up for liberty. That kind of guy deserves a prize like the Heartland Liberty Prize. So we're very happy to have the great Glenn Beck as our keynote speaker and Liberty Prize winner at our benefit dinner. That's on October 4th. That's a Friday coming up pretty soon. Go to heartland.org, click on Glenn Beck's beautiful face, and you can get your tickets.
And the whole event is based around a theme that everyone listening to this should be able to get behind, which is stopping socialism.
Absolutely.
So yes, get your tickets for that.
I'm really excited because Donnie is dressing up as AOC as well.
Stop.
So that'll be really fun. fun.
Oh man, that's a great Halloween costume for Donald.
He has
I'm super excited.
Yeah, Donnie has the hair for it if you just slick it a little bit, so it'll be fine.
Okay, yeah, I gotta like work on
Yeah, there's
bugging my
basically
eyes
no
out.
difference
Yeah.
other than the hair.
Justin, you don't have the hair for it, just FYI.
Nope.
No.
Oh wow.
That's
Wow.
why I wasn't chosen.
All right.
You could be Lennon, though.
That's-
Okay, yeah, we're not we're not dressing up. We're gonna kill that right now. All right. Well, speaking of political figures, we got a couple of updates. In fact, we had one more update right before we were basically starting to record this podcast about our Democratic survivor pool here. So just a few days ago, Jay Inslee was the fourth candidate to drop out of our little survivor pool. And just a little bit of context, so the 5 people that are associated with this podcast, including Jim, Isaac, Justin, I, and producer extraordinaire Andy, who has not been on these radio-only episodes, we drafted each of the candidates. There was 25 candidates that we put in the pool. We drafted them, and basically it's like the less amount of points you get, the better. So first candidate to drop out gets 25 points, next one 24, 23, 22, etc. So Jay Inslee dropped out, which was Isaac's third round pick, which got him 22 points, drops him back into second place. And then right before we were going to go live today, we saw word that Seth Moulton, who I could not even tell you who he is, except for that he was Andy's 5th round pick, just dropped out. But still Andy is in first place, but he was only 4 points ahead of last place, which is Justin Haskins. So the most astonishing part of this is how spread out it is. Yeah. Jim, you have to post a new updated little spreadsheet that you got here on Twitter so that those that are listening can kind of keep track of this. But 5 people out, 1 candidate per team. I couldn't have worked out more perfect.
That's nice. It keeps us all in it.
Right. Those shock you at all, gentlemen? Isaac, Justin, Jay Inslee dropping out was kind of a shock to me, but how about you?
I think that he's just taking a job in the Tom Steyer campaign or something like that, because Jim wasn't was it? What's his name?
Inslee, Jay Inslee.
Jay Inslee. Jim Inslee is a total nobody.
Jeff Inslee.
Yeah, Jeff. That's how bad of a pick that ended up being.
Agreed.
Because he was polling at 0%. Tom Steyer paid enough of his own money to get onto the debate stage, I think.
Oh, wow. So
with him becoming the climate change candidate and with climate change not at the top of anybody's list of priorities, it's not surprising that was it Joe Inslee is no longer in the race.
Justin, anything to add to that?
I love it. I mean, this is just more proof. This guy built his entire campaign around the climate change issue. His whole campaign. That was why he said he ran. The whole thing was built around climate change. And he couldn't manage to get even like 1% of people in the Democratic Party, not even just in America, but in the Democratic Party, he couldn't even get 1% of people to agree with him enough to support him. So I just find it really remarkable. It's more proof. I mean, I know Bernie Sanders and all the others are talking about climate change too, but if this really is a threat, like a threat to humanity, we're all going to die from this sometime very soon, then you would think that the guy who makes that the central focus of his campaign would be able to get a little bit more than 1% of the Democratic demographic to support him, and he couldn't.
It's a good point, and this was a point that I was going to bring up in like another thing that we were going to talk about in a minute, but like in this New York Times article that I have in front of me that I'll get to in a minute, but there is one kind of factoid that they list here that is completely relevant to the point you just made. It says, among registered voters, global warming ranks 17th on a list of 29 important issues. And then it says, but it was 3rd most important issue for liberal Democrats. And it was like saying that as if like, okay, well, generally it's 17th, but it's 3rd when it comes to liberal Democrats. And I was thinking like, it's still only 3rd? Like, how is it like, with the apocalyptic scenarios that they're outlining here and it's only 3rd?
Because impeachment is number 1, obviously. Come on.
Probably. And probably healthcare is number 2. But so, I mean, that kind of just goes to your point there, Justin, but.
It was interesting. Seth Moulton, by the way.
Yeah, who's he?
I had no idea who he was I totally forgot that he was even in the race. I looked him up, and it turns out that he's actually a congressman in Massachusetts. So
What? That's where you're from.
I should probably know that who he is. I started looking. I went to his campaign website for the first time ever, which I'm sure he loves because he just gave up and now he's finally getting some traffic.
Yeah, I'll bet today is the biggest day for traffic for his website.
It probably is. And then you're looking at the things that he has, and it's like I can see why he had no support at all. He's basically like all the other candidates. There's nothing to differentiate him here. Abolishing the Electoral College, Green New Deal. He's got some the typical crazy left-wing stuff like statehood for Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. Yeah, that's got a real good shot of that. He just has some vague things on here. An end to voter suppression.
Dude, you are giving him way too much exposure already.
This is amazing. Well, now he's
getting
gone,
more
so it doesn't
airtime.
matter anymore.
He's getting more airtime on this podcast than every other media outlet combined.
Ooh,
right?
we should extend an invitation to the people who drop out to be on the podcast.
That would be good. That would be good.
I bet this guy would take it. It's probably the only interview offer he's had in this whole campaign.
My 5th round pick was Wayne Messam, who's like some mayor from like South Florida or something like that. And I swear, like, because I've just been like hoping that he just hangs in there a few more candidates. I swear, I probably Googled his name more than he's Googled his name in the past couple of weeks here. The other kind of one thing that I'll just kind of mention that I thought was really interesting was a little fact that I heard a few days ago where actually I think it was Marianne Williamson's tweet herself where she said that she just reached her 130,000th unique donor. And that blew my mind. Like the person whose claim to fame is talking about like energy auras and like crystals and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like she's got 130,000 unique donors. How is that possible?
The power of Oprah.
Is that it?
This is an entire world we have no idea of anything about. Talk about not knowing who somebody is. I mean, I at least heard of Seth Moulton.
Yeah.
Marianne Williamson, like, who the hell is that?
Yeah.
When she started.
No kidding.
You know who
Justin
those people
second
are,
round
though?
pick.
Like, those are the people that read their horoscopes, but they don't do it ironically. They do it for actual guidance.
That's a good point. The
Like,
horoscope
there's a
thing is still
reason those things get printed. And my philosophy is that if you try to base any of your life decisions off what your horoscope says, you shouldn't get to vote.
You sure as heck shouldn't be president.
Oh, man.
Oh,
Can you
geez.
imagine if Trump was just tweeting out like very bad day for Aquarius? They will have
Yeah.
so
Ven-
many bad deals happen.
Venus
to
is
them.
in retrograde. That explains a whole lot.
Sad.
Yeah. So, I'll be curious to see who drops out next. But I could, if we were to plot these on a graph of when they dropped out by what date, we're seeing an exponential growth of these people dropping like flies. So, hopefully, between now and the next next debate, which I think is just next month.
Second week of September sometime.
Yeah, maybe we'll see a few more of these people drop out, and our game will get that more interesting. Related to this whole thing, this cluster of candidates that are competing for the nomination, there was an article that I came across here. Kamala Harris, who basically was approached by a reporter and asked, to increase her chances in New Hampshire or something like that, is she going to have to embrace the label of Democratic Socialist, right? And to which she responded pretty plainly, very bluntly, that nope, I am not a democratic socialist. And then she went into her whole campaign spiel and stuff like that. So, Justin, I'm kind of curious about this because it seems like this is a little bit of a departure from some of the other candidates who are seemingly trying to resuscitate this idea of democratic socialism not being a dirty word. But is this an acknowledgement that socialism is still a politically toxic word, or am I reading too far into this?
I think Kamala Harris knows that if you're going to win in the general election, you can't be labeled a socialist. I think that anyone who's called themselves a socialist is going to have a really hard time winning in the Midwest in the 2020 election. And you can't win if you're a Democrat. It's almost impossible to win without winning most of the northern Midwestern states that they lost to Trump in 2016. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that I would argue Kamala Harris actually is a democratic socialist. I don't really understand how anyone could come to any other conclusion. She co-sponsored the Green New Deal, which, of course, includes a whole slew of socialist programs, single-payer health care, a complete takeover of the energy industry, basic income programs, federal jobs guarantee, rebuilding or altering every single building in the United States, universal access to healthy foods, a whole new system of publicly owned banks. The list goes on and on and on. It is a socialist. There's no question about it. It's a socialist policy program created and led by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and Bernie Sanders, a socialist. I mean, supported openly by socialist groups. I mean, I don't know how anyone can come to any other conclusion. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck.
Right.
And in this
Not
case,
if it doesn't identify as a duck, Justin.
Yeah, get woke,
good point.
Justin. Get
Good
woke.
point.
What are you doing?
Good point.
Well,
also, I love her quote. Can I just read her quote, because her quote's just amazing. This is why Kamala Harris is America's sweetheart now. This is
I'm
the quote.
I'm gonna section that out and quote that. Justin Haskins, Kamala Harris is
They should have a
America's.
Justin drop, and that should be it.
Yeah. This is the quote. She says, "The people of New Hampshire will tell me what's required to compete in New Hampshire," which I think is hilarious. What does that mean? You're just going to do whatever people want? But anyway, but I will tell you, I am not a democratic socialist. I believe that what voters do want is they want to know that whoever is going to lead understands that in America today, not everyone has an equal opportunity and access to a path to success, saying that there needs to be a course correct for income inequality. Right. So that's the support that she has, that she's not a democratic socialist, that she's going to do whatever people say, and that that we need to do something, a course correction for income inequality, and that not everyone has equal opportunity and access to success. How is that proof that she's not a democratic socialist?
Right. Well, and that's kind of why I dismissed that as just being like, she went into campaign speech and stuff like that. But like one of our stated goals, just kind of internally, I guess, for this whole Stopping Socialism project is we wanted to like reassert kind of the dirtiness on that word of socialist, right? We wanted that still to be a kind of a dirty word politically. And like, if democratic socialism is as benign as like, people like Bernie Sanders and AOC want to like make it seem, it seems like that flies in the face of what this is, where she's kind of where Kamala Harris is running away from the term. So I almost chalk this up as a win. I think that this is a really good sign.
Yeah, I think you can make that argument, but I think the important thing for people who support liberty going into 2020, and of course we're a nonpartisan organization, so we're not openly, promoting any particular political candidate or anything like that. But I think the important thing is to call out socialism when you see socialism, and that when these people, because there's going to be a lot of them who, when we get to the general election, start saying, no, I'm not a socialist. I just support common sense reforms and increasing the minimum wage, and that's all I care about. It's important to call these things out for what they actually are. No, these things are socialism.
Right.
If you co-sponsored the Green New Deal, you're a socialist. I don't care what you call yourself. You are a socialist.
Right, I get that, but I think that like really trying to kind of re-demonize the word of socialism is definitely a thing that we have to pursue, because I had just overheard a couple of people talking about like the polling of like people, especially younger peoples, and they're likening to the word socialism. They're like the approval rate of that among young people. But then if you start actually telling them like, okay, well, how about this? And how about this policy? And how about this policy? Then they're like, oh, no, not necessarily. So it's just like they don't even know what socialism is, but they're in support of it. So if we can just kind of put dirt back onto that word, then maybe we start to reverse these trends of showing that socialism is getting more and more popular among the youth. I think this just helps the cause. That's all I'm saying. But, Justin, I'm sure we can go on over and over again with this, but we should move forward. The only other thing that I wanted to tie into this kind of idea of the presidential nomination is Bernie Sanders just came out with his Green New Deal, a $16 trillion climate plan, So the description that I have in front of me is presented by the New York Times. It starts off saying Senator Bernie Sanders on Thursday released a $16.3 trillion blueprint to fight climate change, the latest and most expensive proposal from the field of Democrats, Democratic presidential candidates aimed at reining in planet-warming greenhouse gases. So the plan, which calls for the United States to eliminate fossil fuel use by 2050, which is 20 years saner than AOC's Green New Deal plan. But then it also declares that climate change is a national emergency and envisions building new solar, wind, and geothermal sources across the country and commits $200 billion to help poor nations cope with climate change. He says this will pay for itself over 15 years and create 20 million jobs in the process. Isaac, I assume you didn't parse through all of the words of this report, but does that seem like it jives to you?
It sounds like Bernie's gonna burn.
Is that all you got? Is that your response?
I haven't looked at all of the specifics of this.
Oh, I know
this was
that.
Not in our original
Isaac
thing.
is very
Like,
open-minded. He's still considering it.
So
Right, it's probably okay. We got to just
yeah,
look
but
into
like,
it.
how good are those 20 million jobs gonna be? Are they just gonna be like horse farmers because that's
Well-
all we'll be allowed to use? Like,
Well, you-
Isaac, those jobs don't exist. It's all a lie. So, yeah, they're not going to exist. There's not going to be 20 million jobs. He might as well said 50 billion jobs.
I just
They're
want
not,
to know
it's
how
not
we
real.
got there. Like, I just need to know what the man's thought process is.
Well, I
before
mean, you sent me a little bit of insight right before we went on, talking
Oh,
about
yeah.
the nuclear power aspect of it,
yeah,
right?
he says nuclear power is bad and unsustainable, and that the what was it? The costs of nuclear waste in a potential Fukushima or Chernobyl far outweigh the benefits. And this is coming from the man who, like, the first thing on the top of this Green New Deal page is the climate crisis is not only the single greatest challenge facing our country, it's our greatest opportunity to build a more just and equitable future. So he thinks this is a global emergency, but nuclear power, the only one that can actually do it, is not good.
right.
I mean, it's ridiculous. Actually, I give Bernie's the Bernie staffer who came up with this and wrote it, because Bernie did. I give them credit for actually watching Chernobyl, apparently, because that's now on top of mind again. Chernobyl, which happened
I
so long
know.
ago, thanks to HBO. But again, yeah, just like Isaac said, I mean, look, we are told constantly that we are all going to die. That if we don't reduce our carbon dioxide emissions by at least 80% or so in the next couple of decades, the Earth will be unsustainable for human life, and
Right.
that we are going to be killing all the plants and it's going to be a wasteland, right? And so, what could be more important than that, right? But what's more important to Bernie is shutting down all nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
insane.
Yeah,
It is insane. If you're serious about this, you have to like nuclear. I guess, Justin, some of the jobs that he's going to provide are finding, quote, a real solution to our existing nuclear waste problem. We already have that. It's called getting better at reprocessing used fuel and reusing it
Sure.
and recycling it. And the real problem, of course, is to bury it under Yucca Mountain in the middle of freaking nowhere in Nevada, where no human being would ever go except
you don't even
to
have to do
bury
that.
nuclear waste.
Go ahead,
It's
Isaac.
already secure on site. They're all contained inside of like concrete structures. So like the waste isn't getting out. It's not a problem that there isn't a permanent repository of this, especially if we allow people to reprocess the spent fuel. So like this entire idea of needing this like giant centralized location for it is also wrong, which makes Bernie even more wrong.
Right. But if
Well,
socialists care about people, they should be loving nuclear power, because that is the only thing that can sustain our lifestyles, our standard of living, lift people out of poverty all across the world. There's what is it, Isaac? 1 billion people on this earth who don't have reliable or regular electricity. Let's get it to them. Let's get it to them with nuclear power. Nope, forget it. You guys are going to just suffer. That's what a socialist wants to do. Make everybody suffer.
The plan calls for
Wow.
completely putting a moratorium on nuclear power plant licensing renewals, And it also doesn't include any type of a carbon tax or any type of a carbon capture or anything like that. And then some of the interesting parts, it says like how he's going to pay for this and stuff like that, along with just getting like a seemingly unlimited amount of money from the tax revenue that's going to be from these new jobs that are created. But it says that an estimated $3.1 trillion would be generated from, quote, making the fossil fuel industry pay for their pollution. So they're just going to eat the fossil fuel industry, just take all of their money and pay for it that way.
How are they going to pay for anything if they're bankrupt? Like, that's the thing. Like, what are you going to do? Seize all their assets?
There's a lot of things. Like, yeah.
I mean, a lot of their assets are paper assets for the reserves that they currently hold. But if you can't put the reserves, develop them, then they're worthless.
The most astonishing part of this, and this kind of goes to the point that we were talking about last week, where it's like, all right, don't give any of the climate deniers a voice in your newspaper. It looks like the New York Times kind of took that advice, because the only person that they kind of quote that's in opposition to Bernie Sanders' plan is a Joshua Freed, who is a vice president for clean energy at the centrist Democratic think tank Third Way, where he said that he's not impressed by Mr. Sanders' plan. It says the proposal opposes nuclear energy and carbon capture and storage technology, both of which Mr. Freed said must be tools to decarbonize the economy. So even the Democratic think tank Third Way thinks that Bernie Sanders' plan is off base when it doesn't include nuclear. So it's just like, I mean, it's just, and again, we'll kind of get into this when we just talk about wind and solar being terrible, but the article that we talked about a couple of weeks ago where Michael Moore, and his kind of people kind of came to the conclusion that wind and solar are not enough to deal with this, and that those technologies are horrible and can't work by themselves. So it's like, Bernie, you have to come to this conclusion too.
Another important thing is he spends the whole basis of his argument is that nuclear energy is somehow dangerous, not just dangerous to humans, but just like bad for the environment. It's toxic, all this other stuff. But his whole plan is not, because he's ruled out everything else. It's wind and solar and some hydropower that already exists. That's it. That's all it is.
Geothermal.
Well, how many millions of acres of land are we going to have to destroy in order to do that? You know, how many millions of animals are going to be killed? How many habitats are going to be destroyed? How much toxic waste are we going to have from solar panels and things like that? How much strip mining are we going to have to do to get the rare earth minerals that we need in order to create these technologies? I mean, in order to do the things he wants to do, we have to destroy massive parts of the environment here in the United States and elsewhere. And he has no plan for that. I mean, there are really some pretty incredible things here. But one of the things I just want to touch on, because I know we're going to move on to something else, but this race has become so crazy and so nuts that there are things in these plans that you just gloss over now and you don't even think twice about it.
Yep.
And one of these things struck me that was in this particular Green New Deal plan. And it's not like a huge thing, but you think to yourself, actually, this is pretty incredible that he's suggesting this. So he says here he wants to create these 20 million jobs, end unemployment, he says. End it by creating these 20 million jobs. Now, what does that mean exactly? I don't know, but we're going to create 20 million jobs, and I guess that means we won't have any unemployment anymore. And then he says here, though, that these jobs will be good-paying union jobs. So he wants to create 20 million union jobs. So I looked up how many union jobs there are right now. Does anybody have a guess as to how many union jobs there are in the United States currently?
1.3 million.
No, higher than that. But there is less than 20 million. There's 15 million total.
1.4 million.
Well,
wrong direction.
He's going to keep going up the list. There are 15 million union jobs in the United States right now, about 15 million. That includes public sector and private sector unions. So he wants to more than double all union jobs in the United States. He wants to add 20 million people to the federal government's payroll, apparently. And everybody just kind of reads over that like, oh, yeah, 20 million jobs. Right. I don't know how he's going to create those. Well, he's going to create those jobs by hiring them from the federal government and printing the money. That just in and of itself, itself, is totally crazy.
Speaking of printing money.
No one talks about it.
Speaking of printing money, sir, you told me about who Bernie Sanders' 2020 senior economic advisor is, right?
I did.
That
I did. You
is-
want to break the news to
Oh
the
yeah,
public?
yeah. So that is the one and only Stephanie Kelton, who, if you've listened to our rants on modern monetary theory, she is the biggest champion of that preposterous economic idea, which is basically that debt and deficits don't matter, and that the United States can never default because we just print as much money as we want. That is the road to socialism in the 21st century here, Jim. So I know that you were giving me a hard time talking about modern monetary theory last week, but boom, baby. This is as much proof as you need that this is going to be the path moving forward.
I'm sorry, I started to doze off there a little bit.
Okay.
My eyes
All
glazed
right.
over
It's
when you
like
said that.
they're campaigning against reality.
That's right.
Like,
They
they're
are.
not even campaigning for president. They're campaigning against reality.
That is a good way to put it, sir. But yeah, I mean, we're going to stay in the realm of wind and solar, so I don't really need too much of a transition here. But kind of a recent occurrence in the past week or so comes out of the great state of North Carolina. So I've got an article here that is titled Duke Energy Application Points Fingers at Solar for Increased Pollution. What? How could that possibly be the case? Well, let's see here. It says a 7-month investigation and numerous public information requests have revealed the move to increase solar power might be leading to an increase in the very emissions alternative energy sources aim to reduce. Duke spokeswoman Kim Crawford confirmed that increased solar power on the state's electric grid is increasing emissions of nitrogen oxide, a dangerous air pollutant. She said that reductions in carbon dioxide emissions could also reverse if current solar growth continues without policy changes. Climate advocates blame increases in man-made gases like CO2 for global warming, and have promoted solar power as environmentally clean. An increase in emissions triggers the need to rethink national energy policy, experts say. So what's going on here, Isaac?
Yeah, so solar energy isn't very clean, it turns out, because one of the things that it does is it varies its output based on the amount of sunlight that's coming onto the solar panels. So that fluctuates every single day based on the time of day. But it also transitions, minute to minute based on cloud cover. And even if there's extra particulates in the air, like if it's smoky, there's not as much sun getting to the panels, or even if you don't wash the panels enough. So there's a lot of variation in the amount of electricity that you're going to get from a solar panel. And in order to make sure the grid is balanced, because remember, the grid is not a giant bathtub that stores electricity until you need it later.
Sure.
The grid must be in equilibrium. Supply must meet demand at all times. So you have to ramp up the natural gas power plants in order to, increase the amount of electricity on the grid if the sun isn't shining. And this is actually contributing to the gas plants being less efficient and actually increasing more. So it's like you took a car that was driving in cruise control on the highway, very efficient, optimal gas mileage, and you just made it like drive through town in, stop and start rush hour traffic.
Right.
So that's essentially what's happening here, because the grid operators in North Carolina have to completely shut off their natural gas power plant in order to accommodate all the solar that's on the grid.
Yeah, so Jim, I mean, you brought this topic up to me a couple of days ago. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I read that story about Duke Energy, and I emailed you guys and I said this story is hilarious, and it really is. That North Carolina, they brag about it that they're second only to California in solar, and this is the result of billions in tax breaks, a state mandate to use solar, more than $1 billion in electricity overpayments to customers to subsidize all this solar power, and then as Isaac explained, the state makes them turn off their gas-powered backups, to keep the flow of electricity to the grid steady, and then crank them up at night, because, the sun doesn't shine not only on cloudy days, but it is guaranteed to not shine from about midnight to about 7 a.m. every day. I mean, that's a guarantee. So
Just midnight?
Well, yeah, all right.
What planet are you
I
on,
don't know.
man?
I'm up at the
Alaska,
North Pole.
yeah.
I'm in Alaska, right? Okay, so from sundown to basically 12 hours a day to 15 hours a day, depending on the time of year, you're not going to have the sun shining at all. So you need this, and this is something that I don't think I don't think 90% of environmentalist activists and people who think green energy is great have any idea that every single solar plant and wind farm needs to have fossil fuel backup, or it can't operate, or
Right.
they should just shut it down.
They have no idea.
No,
In Minnesota,
zero.
they're actually mad that they want to build more natural gas plants that are necessary to make sure that the power doesn't go out. They just want the natural gas plants to be replaced with more wind and solar.
Right?
They're
Yeah,
totally clueless.
They
So-
are absolutely clueless. But the thing is, when you crank this up, as a great analogy there, Isaac, like it's difference between driving in cruise control and driving stop and start traffic in a heavy traffic in the city. It spews out more NOx, which is the nitrogen oxide. That is an actual pollutant. That is an irritant.
Yep.
That creates smog and acid rain. Not carbon dioxide emissions are not a pollutant, guys. It's not a pollutant. It does not harm you when you breathe. It does not harm the atmosphere. NOx is. And so I find it hilarious that North Carolina bragging, about how green they are and how we're leading the world in green, the country in green energy. You are making the air dirtier, 3 times dirtier at least than if you just didn't do this. And of course, they still try to virtue signal, but the truth is the truth.
I think the thing that we probably need to address though before moving on is that I hear renewable energy people all the time say, well, yeah, okay, you need to have this fossil. Well, if you can get them to admit that they need fossil fuel backup,
Right.
like a natural gas energy source, something like that. If you can get them to admit that, then what they'll say is, well, we can just create more battery storage. Like, we'll just create more battery storage. And that solves the problem that Isaac mentioned. That solves the problem that Jim was talking about. If we just had more batteries, then we could store the electricity and then use it later on when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. So why can't we just have, more batteries?
Isaac?
Well, I ran the numbers, and 24 hours of battery storage in the great state of Minnesota would cost $133 billion, which is 1/3 of the state's GDP. And that does not include the diminishing amount of power that batteries can store when they get cold, which is customary in Minnesota from, July until May.
I have a question, though. Could we put mittens on the batteries?
So probably. I mean, I've actually thought about how would
That's
you
30
actually
billion
try
extra.
to- Yeah, I mean, because they're all union knitters, and that's what really drives up the cost.
That's how we get those 20 million jobs.
But they're really,
that's
really great
probably
mittens.
part of it.
Yeah.
Like, who's knitting battery sweaters?
Look,
Yeah.
Joe Bast, our former president and founding president of Heartland, would say all the time, look, the Heartland Street is not against renewable energy. We're against the insanity of trying to impose it right now.
Right.
If technology had advanced enough so that you could store wind and solar in batteries long enough to keep powering and keep society going overnight when the sun isn't shining and then the wind doesn't blow for a few days, fine, that's great. If it's economically efficient.
Well-
we do not have the technology, let alone how expensive it would be to do this. And again, this goes back to you, Justin. What is in a battery? What kind of those are minerals, right? Those are
Rare earth materials.
Rare earth materials. You're going to do a lot of environmental damage to dig all that lithium up.
The amount of lithium, yeah, absolutely.
And the cobalt.
I mean, that is a
But
good
at
point,
least,
though.
forget
At least
about the
that gets
cobalt.
done in the Congo by children where nobody pays attention.
Well,
right?
how do you determine if wind and solar are economically feasible? Oh, you let capitalism do its job. That's how. You don't have mandates from the government that's imposing this stuff, and without any type of thought about what the unintended consequences are or anything like that.
Oh, but by the way, if people wanted to spend more for these renewable energy sources, then they could. Like people could just demand more expensive energy and just pay for it, and we would already have it. So this idea that everybody wants it, but we can't get it because, the evil fossil fuel companies are stopping it is totally ridiculous. If everybody just said, I want it right now, we demand it, we have to build it, then we would have it. The fact that we don't have it is because people don't want it. Not as much as they want to save their own money. That's the point.
Yeah,
Totally agree.
Some of the quotes from this Kim Crawford, the spokesman for Duke Energy, are kind of interesting. It says that in general, she said that increasing solar generation tends to decrease CO2 emissions if nuclear generation and other factors remain constant. Quote, as the result of solar generation increases, however, this effect will diminish and could reverse at some point due to decreasing room for more efficient generation, said Crawford. More lower efficiency generators designed for short cycles could ultimately be used to provide contingency power for intermittent solar, according to Crawford. She cited studies that concluded utilities must cut solar power off from the electric grid more frequently as solar production expands. That's because more electricity is produced than can be used or exported to other states. So it's like there's almost too much solar going into the grid that she's saying here. And it says that later on that the other thing that they would have to do, because they don't have the power lines to just basically give this energy to other states, that the other viable option is to ramp down nuclear power, which is a little bit more difficult because it's not quite as just easy to just put the switch on and off as a natural gas. But the problem there is that nuclear generation is where they're getting most of their quote unquote clean carbon free energy. So it's like it's just going to completely bite them in the backside there. But
these people are so stupid. Can I just say that? They are so stupid. Like the idea that they could manage this is just utterly ridiculous. The more we hear about this, the more stupid it is. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Like I understand why people want this to work because the idea of it breeds warm, fuzzy feelings.
Yeah, that's it.
But people also wanted to be able to think that their Beanie Baby purchases would fund their retirement. Like,
wait, are you saying that was a bad investment?
Well, I would just suggest that you go on eBay and see how much your Magic the Dragon goes for. Yeah, I had them.
Yeah, I've got a first edition Legs the Frog. You're telling me that I can't?
Hell yeah! Is the tag still on it?
Yeah, no doubt.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be worth something big in the future. Like you hold on to that, Donald.
So I've got Duke Energy's kind of response to this story because it was making its rounds and stuff like that. And so this is called "Solar Power Causes Air Pollution." Wait a minute. So, along with acknowledging that they only get 5% of their energy from solar, it says that since 2005, Duke Energy has decreased carbon dioxide emissions by 31%, sulfur dioxide emissions by 96%, and nitrogen oxide emissions by 74%. This comes from a power facelift, adding advanced air controls, retiring nearly 6,200 megawatts of coal and replacing that with more efficient natural gas and zero-emitting renewables. We expect to retire more than blah, 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 blah. So let me translate that for you. And Isaac, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But that basically is just thank you, fracking.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a combination of, oh, yeah, who would have thought we can put filters on the coal plants and reduce the amount of pollution that they emit? Crazy.
Right.
Also, yeah, thank you, fracking. That's part of it. But it's also Duke Energy looking to pad their pockets by closing down coal plants that are probably older and no longer giving them a guaranteed profit because they're a monopoly utility, and going with gas because it gives them a guaranteed like 7 to 10% profit. So this is all just like, if anybody ever says that government isn't driving the rush to renewables or natural gas, then you're absolutely wrong, because it's the subsidies for wind and solar, it's the mandates for wind and solar, and then it's also the government guaranteeing these utility companies a guaranteed profit on shutting down old depreciated assets and then building new crap.
But what I don't understand still, though, is even if that's the case, and I believe it absolutely is the case, why are they so anti-nuclear? Like, I understand why some people
covered this, sir.
Why are they so anti-nuclear?
We covered this, sir. It's because that wind and solar are the energies that if we basically tether ourselves just to those things, it requires a dramatic overhaul of how society is constructed. If we just moved over...
Do you mean the utilities, Justin, or do you mean...
Yeah,
the Bernie Sanders.
Like, why not just... Why don't they want it?
We understand why the renewable energy advocates want things that don't work, because that's all they ever want.
Yeah.
But, I think that they would want that because nuclear has a very large upfront capital investment. So that would increase their guaranteed profits. But also, nuclear plants last for 80 years, and wind turbines last 20, solar panels last 30, natural gas, coal plants can last 60 years. So when you're looking at it of how much will they make in guaranteed profits, it's actually optimized by having the least amount of efficient stuff on the grid as possible. So utilities are incentivized to be as bad as possible, and they are more than happy to give the regulator what it wants in that way.
And Isaac, you and the utilities you get subsidies if you do wind and solar. You get paid to
Correct.
do it, and but it actually costs you a lot of money to do nuclear. I mean, how long does it take if you were to propose, if a utility was to propose a new nuke plant right now? How long would it take to get that online when you go through all the regulatory loop, hurdles and all of that, right?
Probably a ton.
Oh man, it would take, you're probably looking at 7 years minimum and up to 15.
Yeah.
It's a long process. So
As opposed to getting
other
paid
countries,
as opposed to getting paid tomorrow to start doing wind turbines.
exactly.
Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to point out, and I just does Bernie Sanders know this? I wonder, because he always kind of points to those Nordic countries, and oh, they're doing free college, oh, they're doing free healthcare, everything that they're doing seems to, be fine for them, so we can do it here, right? It's did he ever look at how Sweden gets their energy? It's 40% from nuclear energy.
And the rest is large hydro.
Yeah, and then another 40% from hydro, right? So it's come on, dude.
Bernie doesn't live on this planet. Why are we still holding him to normal people standards?
That's a good point.
That's a good point. He belongs at a retirement home.
He does. I was just going to say that.
I just want to rush through this one last bit here. This is from the Institute for Energy Research, and it's called "Wind Power is Collapsing in Germany." It says new onshore wind energy is in steep decline in Germany. The expansion of onshore wind energy in the first half of this year is at its lowest level since the introduction of Germany's Renewable Energy Act in 2000. This is an 82% decline compared to the first half of just last year, and it's well below the levels needed for the country to meet its targets established by their energy policy that they have enacted. So then the biggest reasons for this, and this is something that we've covered a lot of times when we're talking about wind and solar, is basically permit disputes. So there's a lot of rabble being roused by the local residents that are protesting in many of these parliaments that these wind farms basically need to be a minimum distance away from residential developments, et cetera, et cetera. So the permitting, because basically the political class is responding to these protests, the permitting has gotten much slower. It says the German permitting process used to take 10 months and is now taking over 2 years to get a new project to get through the system here. And it kind of goes through all the different things in that, which is pretty interesting. Everything we talk about will be posted in the show notes. But the other thing that they point to is the decreasing subsidies. So the German government also forced the wind power industry to cut costs, introducing a market-based tendering model. The economic and legal risks have made investors leery about investing in wind projects without the massive government-mandated subsidies that the wind industry enjoyed. In addition to that, I've got a piece from the Manhattan Institute's Robert Bryce, who we've had on this podcast, that's titled Big Wins, Big Headwinds, and where it basically talks about all these examples across the country of these projects kind of being stifled by usually concerns that come from kind of the eco-left in terms of birds getting killed and stuff like that. So
Sure.
I won't go through all of them exactly, but it talks about the situation that's going on in Oregon. There's one going on in North Dakota, New York, Indiana, Germany, which I just talked about with that other article. We've talked in the past about California and Vermont running into these things. So it's just the politics alone, not taking into account all of the other things, it makes this plan that's being proposed by Bernie Sanders just impossible. So, then I guess I could rehash all the other things that we've already talked about, the amount of rare earth materials that this would need, strip mining, all of this different stuff. The cost for these energies obviously higher than their alternatives, the reliable sources and stuff like that. The one that I thought was really interesting, and you kind of make mention of this in your tweets and stuff like that, Isaac, is in Minnesota when it was so cold that the wind turbines didn't even work. Like, what a nightmare that would be if we're in
It
the...
was literally too cold.
Right.
They actually became net consumers of electricity in order to prevent the oil in the gearboxes from freezing.
At the time when we would need energy the most, during the coldest
Yes.
parts of the year, you cannot count on wind power. It's unbelievable. It's absolutely unbelievable.
We've
Yeah,
spent all of this money building wind and solar, and we can't even flip the on switch.
It's right.
Yeah.
It's like
It's amazing. Yeah, I love the part where it talks about how one of the biggest reasons, in fact, the first reason it mentions for why they've had problems getting these things built is that local residents have been protesting
Yeah, exactly.
and that they don't want the wind farms near their house
Yep.
and that it needs to be a minimum distance away from residential developments. And so all these licensing authorities in the country have been much more cautious, is the word that they use in the article. And as a result of it, the permitting has got slower and more complex. And there's all these problems related to that. That's actually an extremely underrated part of all of this.
You're right.
Because if you're going to scale this whole thing up so that we're relying exclusively on these sorts of things, you're going to have people suing, you're going to have people complaining, you're going to have people protesting everywhere.
And the
everywhere.
best example of that is something that we've talked about on this podcast before, but there was like some southern county in basically in the middle of nowhere in South California where they were going to put like this big wind farm or solar farm or something like that. There was like nobody that lives there, but there was like these massive protests because of like how it would
San
affect
Bernardino County, the largest county in California.
Right. How it was going to affect like the turtles in the area or something like
Yep.
that. It's like if you can't get something built there, where are you going to build this, man?
See, and that's where this all goes back into socialism, because ultimately, if they really are serious about this and really wanted to do it, our liberty and our freedom has to go.
It's secondary.
Property rights become absolutely out the window because you can't make this happen without making people comply.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to complain about it. Too close to your house? Too bad. We have to save the planet. That's where this ultimately leads, and that's why socialism and the Green New Deal and green energy are really mixed or linked together.
Absolutely. All right, we have to make some time here for our last topic of discussion, which is about the Facebook censoring and the report that just came out about it. So in front of me, I got a couple of pieces. First one being the actual op-ed authored by the leader of this, the head of this kind of research council or whatever, is from the Wall Street Journal, or as Michael Scott and I call it, The Wall, titled Why Conservatives Don't Trust Facebook. So it kind of goes through and kind of sets the context, Facebook stifling conservative speech, blah, 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 blah. And then it says, in response to the mounting criticism, Facebook asked me, who is John Kyle, and that is not the protagonist in the upcoming Terminator movie. He is actually a former U.S. Senator from Arizona. So they asked me to conduct a survey to hear from conservatives directly following substantial public interest in the project, blah, 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 blah. So basically he talks to 133 different conservative organizations and individuals to find out what their main concerns are when it comes to Facebook supposedly censoring conservatives. So among the 6 buckets that he says that these voices generally fall into, we've got content distribution and algorithms. So this is like the built-in bias for the Facebook algorithms. Content policies, so prohibiting hate speech and the idea that this is subjective and ever-evolving nature of this, so we can't really know what hate speech ever is. Content enforcement, so it's the kind of the disproportionate censoring of conservatives. Ad policies, and we already know that pretty well just because of the issue that Justin went through a few months ago. Ad enforcement and a workforce viewpoint diversity. So basically that there's just run by a bunch of liberals. So of course this is what happened. So in response to all of this, they did get some changes. Facebook did agree to a few changes. But before I get to any of those, Jim, were we asked, was the Heartland Institute one of these 133 organizations that was talked about in this?
We were contacted.
Oh, nice.
Yes. Yeah, we've been on the forefront of it. In fact, we were one of the few organizations to actually give John Kyle and his team of lawyers looking into this some actually useful information, because we've tracked our Facebook impressions and engaged users and other key stats at Facebook for several years. I don't think a lot of our other think tanks peers do. At least we were told that, because they're like, wow, we didn't get this info from anybody else. And so we actually shared with them a chart, which can be put in the show notes too. It can be people look at it for themselves. But you know, it's kind of funny. In the summer of 2016, a few months before something pretty important was happening in that November, you know, the Heartland Institute watched our average daily impressions of the things we put on our Facebook page, plus our daily engaged users, absolutely crater. Right in the middle of July, or in the beginning of July, it went straight down. In fact, at one point, you know, from 2015 to 2016, the Heartland Institute averaged 45,000 daily impressions, and then by the end of December of 2016, we were down to 20,000 average per day. And in fact, we had 2,000. We would have 2,000 or so daily engaged users at our peak, kind of at a good time, maybe even 3,000. By the end of December, our daily engaged users was down to 62. There's a chart here that shows that it went down. So yeah, we were quite aware of the impact and had proof data of how Facebook was just basically, hiding conservatives from their usership.
Yeah, and then we obviously know Justin's ordeal, where he had his ad for the Stopping Socialism Project kind of derailed for no other reason than they just didn't like what he had to say. That was basically the gist of it. And then the biggest proof on that one of the bias was that they reinstated it after he talked about it on Fox News. So was it
after I
big
appealed
enough
it
mic-
like.
Yep.
After I appealed it like 7 times.
Yeah.
I appealed it like every other week for 2 months. And then I go on Fox News and like the next day it's all over.
So then Facebook kind of responding to the report that was given to them by this John Kyle and his little crew, they agreed to some changes here. These changes include an oversight board that will hear appeals from some more difficult content removal decisions that hopefully will ensure that there is more thoughtful discussion on what constitutes something that should be removed. Explanations for their news feed rankings. Facebook has launched a transparency tool that explains to users why they see certain content in their news feed. Page transparency, which has to do with people kind of getting an explanation of why that their thing was marked false. Staffing, they're going to have 4 additional people basically devoted exclusively to working with smaller organizations to resolve questions and complaints about the decisions.
Wow, 4 people, really?
I know. Ad labeling requirements, and some other ad policies. And basically this John Kyle says that these are steps in the right direction, but admits that conservatives no doubt will and should continue to press Facebook to address the concerns that arose in this survey. So is the fact that they made these changes just a way for them to placate the kind of the voices out there, the kind of the squeaky wheel, or is this an acknowledgement that they did have a bias and that they were trying to do things to correct it?
It's actually not an acknowledgement they had a bias. They actually don't really admit any of that.
Sure.
And in fact, the Media Research Center, led by Brent Bozell, they are the leaders of something called the Free Speech Coalition that the Heartland Institute was in on very early. And I have personally taken part in these discussions and email threads. And we are presenting a united front against not just Facebook, but Twitter and Google and all the rest. And I emailed Media Research Center. They were asking for my thoughts on this. And I said, yeah, John Kyle's a nice guy, but I expected him to get duped. And he did. I mean, he's a squish on this. He was never really a very strong conservative in the Senate. He's not the kind of guy that would take a stand and risk, popularity. I mean, he's in the private sector now. He's in a lobbying firm. He's in that's the kind of thing that he does. You can't get too crazy on that stuff. So that makes this even worse. And his Wall Street Journal piece, it actually hurts our position on this topic. It doesn't help it at all. I mean, an oversight board. I mean, come on. I mean, really, an oversight board. Why not a blue ribbon commission that will give us a report? Maybe, I don't know, around December of 2020. How about that? I mean, that's about as useful as a freaking oversight board. 4 people. They have employed 4 people to reach out to smaller and mid-sized conservative organizations. Not to mention people like Justin Haskins. There's the individuals that are not an organization per se, but an individual who has cachet, who has influence as a conservative on Facebook. You guys are out of luck. Forget you guys. And the idea, look, Facebook, we don't need you to explain your newsfeed rankings. We already know the explanation. You guys favor CNN and New York Times and Washington Post and HuffPost And you never call those lefty outfits suspect, but maybe you let Fox News feed go in there once in a while, and that's just the exception. So we don't need you to explain these rankings. We just need you to stop being so biased toward leftists and stop discriminating and hiding conservative news and views. That's what has to happen here. Nothing in this report says that this is going to happen. I think it's an entire whitewash, and I think conservatives really need to believe and know that Facebook is not their friend. They are not. They don't want to date you. They're just stringing you along until after 2020.
Yeah. I just go ahead.
I think it's important also to understand that they can't admit that they are guilty of this, because if they admit that they're guilty of this, then not only does it prove that they've been lying to us for all of these years, or they've been saying that this isn't true. But in addition to that, it calls into question whether they should be considered an open platform anymore,
which is the biggest
legally.
point of this whole thing.
And that's their biggest concern, because if they lose that status and all of a sudden they're legally publishers, well, then they're legally liable for the things that are said on their platform, including the things that are crazy and the things that are obviously false and everything else. You could sue them in court, just like you can sue the New York Times or the Washington Post or something. And so they can't admit it. They can't. They have to say, unless they're going to admit it and then completely change their model, and they could do that, but why would they do that? They're just going to keep pretending like this isn't a problem. They're going to keep appointing useless politicians because when you have a real problem, that's who you turn to, right? Some senator somewhere who's going to lead some, like Jim said, some panel, some commission. I mean, give me a break. Like, when did these people ever figure anything out? The answer is never. Well, and that's exactly why they did it. They knew what they were going to get.
Well, that's right. And and I didn't even think about this when I was doing the prep for the show, but when I was just reading off all of the things that they were going to supposedly change, I felt like I was just doing an ad for Facebook. Like, this is just like a marketing thing for Facebook. Like, it's a publicity stunt to be like, oh no, conservatives, we're, fair and balanced now, check us out. So I almost felt dirty reading that.
Not a single conservative should think that this is anything other than a whitewash. And you're absolutely 100% correct there, Justin, on the publisher versus platform thing. Because if they're called a publisher by the Communications Decency Act, their entire business model just absolutely immolates. It's gone. Yeah. And this is one of the biggest companies in the world. And so they're doing everything they can to not make that happen. But let's be honest here. They want to play referee. They want to influence things, but they didn't do this. I mean, Justin, you've been on Facebook a long time, myself as well. In 2015, this was never an issue, ever. I didn't hear one conservative complain about this ever in 2015. And then suddenly around 2016, something happened. Again, something happened. What happened is that Hillary Clinton lost. Almost everything involving free speech today, and the power that social media companies and others have over what you see and how you see it and how often you see it, and all of that all boils down to the fact that they can't get over that Hillary Clinton didn't win the election. They think right now, oh my God, we didn't do it enough to stop Donald Trump. We're never going to let that happen again. Yeah. And so all this is dancing around that. None of these discussions would be happening right now if Hillary Clinton had won the election. Zero. Yeah. None of it. And it's all happening because of Donald Trump. And if you do not realize that, you don't really understand what it is happening right now. Silicon Valley is engaging in a war on free speech. And the people that are victimized by that are people that are not on the left, which means you and me, which means ordinary people. That's what's happening. Silicon Valley is convinced they will take every risk necessary to make sure Donald Trump isn't reelected, because that can't happen. The people cannot have a voice. The elites, Silicon Valley, will pick our leaders for us.
Well, I'm not going to top that, so we should probably just call it an episode, ladies and gentlemen. Isaac, Justin, any last words of wisdom or anecdotes, jokes, or anything you want to get off your chest before we sign off for the week?
Nope.
Isaac.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Don't drink and drive.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in for this episode. Please tune in every Friday for a new episode of the In the Tank podcast. If you like our show, please subscribe. Write a review for us on iTunes. That would be greatly appreciated. You could also find us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, pretty much everything nowadays, even YouTube. I know that we're not recording this visually, but it will still be up there on YouTube if that's the way you want to get your whatever. If you want to follow us, you can on Twitter at InTheTankPod. If you want to send us your comments, suggestions, questions, anecdotes, jokes, whatever you would like, feel free to reach out to us at InTheTankPod podcast@gmail.com. Jim, where can the fine people find you?
They can find me at JetX Guy screaming into the microphone and on Twitter, or actually Jay Lakely at Twitter, and Heartland Inst.
Isaac, where can the fine people find you?
Isaac Orr on Twitter and at AmericanExperiment.org.
Fantastic. And Justin.
Just kidding. I'm still the fracking guy. I didn't change my Twitter handle.
I didn't even listen to you. And Justin, where can the fine people find you?
On Twitter and Facebook at Justin T. Haskins.
Fantastic. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel and consider donating to the Heartland Institute to support more vibrant free markets, greater individual liberties, and more videos like this one.